The conflict between Mexico and America in the Mexican-American War and the compromise that was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo took sacrifice and negotiation. Before any conflict had happened, the U.S. had their eyes on having control over land from the east coast to the west coast of America. This was called Manifest Destiny. In the eyes of Americans, it was their Christian, God-given right to have the land, but to many other nations and native tribes, it was seen as greedy. Manifest Destiny was a major factor in the war and in the mistreatment of Mexico. The conflict started before the war, in January 1823, when Mexico had let Americans settle in the land known as Tejas, eventually Texas, to farm and live. Most Mexicans at that point didn't live in Texas. The soil was less fertile in the areas around Mexico City, and there were heavy threats from the native tribes. With nothing coming from Tejas, Mexico starts to sell acreage to the U.S. citizen for very cheap to have a use for the land. The first Americans settled in Texas in late 1821, under the land grant that Stephen F. Austin obtained from Mexico. The main conflict with Mexico letting Americans settle was the difference in laws. U.S. law allowed slavery, while Mexico had abolished it. Most of the American settlers ignored Mexican law and brought and used slaves anyways. This started tension between Mexico and the U.S. The last straw for Mexico was when Texas had declared independence from Mexico in March of 1836. U.S. President Polk offered millions of dollars to Mexico for California and Arizona, and Mexico rejected. Mexico saw this as an invasion of their border treaty with America. Acting as if they still had control over Texas, even after Texas had declared independence, Mexico became offended when the U.S. had proposed annexing Texas in July of 1845. To show their military strength, General Santa Anna sent troops south of the Nueces River after a sting of the loss of land, sparking the start of the Mexican-American War. Many people were against this war on both sides. Amy Greenberg, professor of history at Pennsylvania State University, said,
From the Mexican perspective was that Mexico was in such fragile political control. There were all of these coups one after another. Mexican president could not afford to negotiate with the Norte Americanos, because if they did, then they would lose power. So there was no way in which the United States was justified in starting the war against Mexico.
The United States was exploiting Mexico's land for their own benefit. America had taken Texas as a state of their own country and wanted other lands that Mexico had. When Mexico had rejected, America had then turned to start conflict and used the idea of manifest destiny to defend it. The U.S. politicians were defending the war by their godly right to spread coast to coast. The thought that one country has the only God-given right to land can cause war by saying that another country should give over the land because they didn't have that right, disregarding if the country had that land for generations. There was also conflict between politicians. On one occasion, Mexican General Francisco Mejas said, "The annexation of the Department of Texas to the United States does not yet satisfy the ambitious desires of the degenerate sons of Washington," demonstrating the negative views from the Mexicans that Manifest Destiny had, illustrating that there will be no end to the conflict until the U.S. had completed Manifest Destiny. The war itself was completely one-sided, with the U.S. having more military power and Texans knowing the landscape of the area. The U.S. Army was equipped with more reliable and advanced weaponry. Mexico was at a disadvantage since the majority of Mexicans were most familiar with the area around Mexico City, not the hills and valleys of Texas. The U.S. won almost all the battles. This eventually made the citizens of Mexico angry at their weak and prideful leaders. The Mexican citizens started to have ideas about revolting and did years later, throwing out the politicians and implementing new systems and leaders. Mexico's losses in the war led to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The start of the war showed how one-sided this war is. In May 1846, in the Battle of Palo Alto, Mexican troops were conquered by the U.S.'s tactical strategy and advanced cannons. America's front pushed farther south after the capture of Monterrey in September 1846, surrounding the town and having Mexican troops ask for a parley. The U.S. Army led the start of many assaults that would lead to the defeat of the Mexican Army during the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April 1847. The Mexican front only worsened when the storming of Chapultepec had taken the last defense from Mexico City in September of 1847. Mexico was backed into a corner, and in self-preservation, they surrendered Mexico City to U.S. troops on September 14, 1847. This was the end of the Mexican-American War, forcing Mexico to surrender. After severe loss of life on both sides and destruction of multiple Mexican towns, U.S. and Mexican representatives came together to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848. The treaty ended the war in exchange for $15 million from the U.S. to the Mexican government for damages done to the towns, and for all the land from Texas to the West Coast. Even at that point, there were many people against signing it. Some Mexican politicians didn't want to look weak and bow down to Americans, along with U.S. officials who felt sorry for America's invasion and destruction of Mexican civilian towns. Because of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. received land that included 8 current states. It opened up economic and religious opportunities by planting the foundation for gold mining in the West and giving a refuge for religious persecution to discriminated Mormons. The immediate effect of gaining this land was the harvesting of natural resources such as the gold rush of 1849 in California, thus being a factor in making California the 31st state in 1950. Just a couple of years after getting the land from Mexico. There is also conflict over what laws will be in these new states. With many of the states wanting slavery abolished, it started tension between the northern and southern states of America, which became America's Civil War. In the 21st century, most of the land acquired by the U.S. is the most economic and religiously diverse in America. The West had opened up gold mines in the U.S., and also the movement of the Mormon Church gave way as a religious hub in the northwest of America. In Mexico, the direct result of war gave birth to the idea of revolution. Knowing how weak their government was, Mexican civilians started movements such as Guerra de Reforma, the Reform War, in 1857 to replace the prideful politicians. In the present, the effect of the war was that America advanced far ahead of Mexico in development. With less land and less of a centralized government, Mexico fell behind the rest of the world. Having Mexico be less of a world power, thus not getting into industrialization as quick as America and not partaking in World War I, had the effect of not developing as quickly, making the difference today in the two adjoining countries.